Welcome to this webinar on emerging opportunities in design standards for our built environment, well-being, inclusion, and universal design. My name is Elizabeth O'Farrell, and I work here at NSAI as a project manager for standards in the area of universal design, accessibility, and usability. On this slide, I give an overview of how we are going to run our webinar. The webinar will run until 12 noon. This webinar will be recorded and will be available later at www.nsai.ie. Please use the Q&A function if you would like to pose a question to the speakers, and there will be a Q&A after all the presentations. The chat function is being monitored by our team this morning. Please note your camera and microphone have been disabled. Please use the raise hand function if you prefer to ask your question verbally during the Q&A. The webinar is live captioned. Please use the CC function in Zoom. And ISL interpretation is provided. On this slide, we give an overview of the agenda or program for our webinar. We have the opening of the webinar by myself this morning, Elizabeth O'Farrell, a welcome by Dr. Gerard Craddock from CEUD at the NDA, opening remarks by Geraldine Larkin, the CEO of NSAI, opening keynote by Selina Bonney. Then we have presentation 1 on introduction and background to these standards. Presentation 2, standard ISEN 17210 in the Irish regulatory context. Presentation 3, using the standards in daily practice. And then we will have reflections on these standards by Minister Anne Rabbitte after we have our Q&A session. And then we will have closing remarks by Dr. Gerard Craddock. I'd like to welcome now Dr. Gerard Craddock, Chief Officer of the Centre for Excellence in Universal Design at the NDA, and also Chair of the NSAI Universal Design Standards Consultative Committee, NSAI TC23. Dr. Gerard Craddock is the Chief Officer at the Centre for Excellence in Universal Design, a statutory body established by the Irish government in 2007. It is part of the National Disability Authority, which is the lead state agency on disability in Ireland. The Centre's key domain areas are the built environment, products and services, and information and communication technologies, ICT. The Centre's focus is on infusing universal design into education curricula at all levels, developing standards in professional and industrial services, and creating awareness of the benefits of universal design within Ireland, as well at European and international level. As already said, Ger is the chair of NSAI TC23, where he and the experts of the committees participate in the development of national, European, and international standards development. Welcome, Ger.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Delighted to be part of this here this morning, and welcome everyone. I think we have over 300 registered for this event this morning. So without further ado, I will progress the slides here. And just to give an idea of the work we're involved in and the collaboration we have in place with the National Standards Authority going back from about 2005, 2006, this working collaboration. And part of the standard work that we're involved in, we have a number of subcommittees, and the one that is heavily involved in this work this morning is Subcommittee 1, chaired by Tom Gray. And on the slide you see here, the participants and the hardworking individuals bringing their expertise, both knowledge and expertise, but also voluntary time and energy over the last 4 to 5 years on bringing this national and European standard to life. So we're delighted with the group here this morning. As I said, Tom Gray, we've Ruth O'Reilly, we've Paddy Healy and Gary Carney, who are in the background this morning. We'll hear further from Caitríona Shaffrey, Fionnuala Rogerson and Eoin O'Dowd. So just sorry there, I think I just went on mute. So just briefly what a standard is. It's a document established by consensus. Very important that it is about consensus. And it is approved by a recognised body, so the National Standards Authority in Ireland, but also then the European standards bodies, SEN, SENELEC, at a European level, and also work that we've done at international level by the International Standards Organization that provides for common and repeated use. So it has rules, guidelines, or characteristics for activities or their results. So aimed at the achievement of the optimum degree of order in a given context. So very much what we're talking about here, the optimum degree on looking at the accessibility of the public, the built environment. So again, standards are a voluntary agreement and are developed with an open process that gives all stakeholders, including consumers, the opportunity to express their views, have those views considered. This contributes to their fairness and market relevance and promotes confidence in their use. So not only had we the experts at a national level, but we had 15 other national standards bodies across Europe involved in developing this standard. And with that, there was over 10 user bodies such as ANIC, the European Disability Forum, Age Platform Europe, also involved as examples of user involvement in development of this standard. So why are standards important, and particularly for persons with disabilities? They harmonise approaches to accessibility requirements at European level. This means that same rights and access level across Europe, such as freedom of movement, as part of that. All right, slides are moving on here. I'm not sure what is happening there. Have I lost control there? Just going back a slide there. Not at the moment. Someone requesting control, no blue. So thank you for that. That means same rights across level access across Europe. So freedom of movement being a critical aspiration and right for persons with disabilities right across Europe. They facilitate compliance with existing laws, such as the new Web Accessibility Directive. They improve service and product quality and safety, which is very important. Increase consumer choice and reduce uncertainty. And again, a key part of that in consumer choice is that with a common standard across Europe, that also the cost can be considerably reduced, being a key aspect of having a common European standard. Also, the whole interoperability of components made by different companies possible. So there's some, and you will hear more throughout this morning. So without further ado, I'm delighted to have the CEO, Geraldine Larkin, who will now formally address and the opening of this webinar this morning. So over to you, Geraldine.
And thank you very much, Ger. And can I echo Ger's welcome to everybody online this morning? And I think it's testament to the importance of this standard that we have so many people here together this morning. And I also look forward to the recording of this afterwards, which of course will broaden the application of the standard and our discussion today even more so. So thank you to the committee for all the hard work that is done and gone into getting us where we are today. Because this is a really, really important block of work. And it's really great that so many of you have gathered here together today, because the webinar and indeed the standard illustrates that we are living in a time of change. I don't need to mention that's almost the obvious, but for me, the importance of this standard is the opportunities it brings for those who are willing to embrace it and take it on as a tool for innovation. Because the standard highlights that well-being, inclusion, and universal design are not only important to build an equitable society, but they're also opportunities that we really must grasp and take forward. And Ger talked about standards being best practice, repeated order. And I think that's the huge part about this. This work is the culmination of debate and discussion, not just in Ireland, but right across Europe. And it's from that we're learning from the best minds across Europe. And the opportunities presented today are supported by standardized products and processes in all the areas of the NSEI activity. And these are products and processes that help global economies run smoothly and efficiently. And as I said, promote best practice. But standards don't just stop and finish from a business perspective. Standards are also really, really important in improving the health and well-being of billions of people around the world, and indeed have a critical role to play as well in the Sustainable Development Goals and ensuring a much more sustainable world for everyone going forward. So when you step back from standards are very important both for our economy and for our society. And indeed, that reflects the core message and the core intention of the NSEI over the next coming years. And that is that we're supporting innovation to ensure a safer, better and sustainable future for everyone, for business and citizens alike. Because we recognize that standards are enablers for business to meet obligations laid out in legislation. But they also, and I suppose this is the really fundamental part, standards drive innovation, they drive best practice and a much more inclusive environment. And in this case, looking at the particular standards we're talking about today, a much more inclusive built environment. And that is of benefit to all of us, regardless of our age, our where we're at, or anything else from our backgrounds. The standards that will be discussed today provide designers, procurers and organizations a means to understand the diverse needs of our population. And they will help set goals to achieve a much more inclusive built environment. And I think the great advantage of the suite of standards being considered today is that they're applicable to buildings in both the public and private sector. So there are learnings for those of you who are involved in designing and procuring commercial buildings, but that equally applies in the area of private housing and indeed public spaces. So that all of the outputs and all of the areas that you're engaged in will have longevity and are accessible and usable for the widest range of users. And that's users who might be younger or older. It may be parents or guardians with young children, or indeed persons with disabilities. So it covers, and it is broad and completely inclusive. And from that, I mean, there's a huge marketing and business opportunity, as well as an inclusivity opportunities here, in that adherence to the standards and utilization of the standards to support innovation will increase footfall for retail and increase market share, while also strengthening our economy, but building a better society for us all to live in and to be proud of. And Ger mentioned the work of the NSAI Consultative Committee, TC23, on universal design. And I suppose I want to make a special call out and shout out to Standing Committee SC1, who have focused on the built environment and whose work we are really seeing today. And for those of you who are not as closely involved in standards, to draw to your attention and to recognize that the work of these people, who, as Ger said, is done on a voluntary basis, has really heavily influenced the final document that is the output of this from a European perspective. And this is one of the key advantages of standards, is that Ireland has, and our Irish experts in every area have a direct role and a direct opportunity to influence on the European stage and indeed on the international stage. So it's hugely important. And I really do want to acknowledge the time and expertise that the committee members have given, because it is of huge, enormous benefit, both to the country and to European citizens alike. And it really epitomizes public service and what the true meaning of delivery in that space. So on my behalf, I want to acknowledge all the contributions that you are making to make Ireland a far better place for us all to live and to work. I hope today that the debate and discussion is illuminative, informative, and advances this agenda. And finally, before I close, I want to acknowledge and to thank in advance Minister Anne Rabbitte, who will be closing the event later today. So thank you very much. So back to you.
Thank you very much, Geraldine, and for the insight there on the impact standards can have, but also I think, as you mentioned there, the public service, particularly the committee involved in this standard, like we're going back here 4 or 5 years work to actually bring it to this stage here this morning. So thank you very much for that, Geraldine. So moving on to our keynote, and delighted to have Selina Bonney with us here this morning. Selina is South Dublin County Council's Disability Liaison, Access and Equality Officer. This involves assisting the council to meet its responsibilities under disability, equality and human rights legislation, and to support the provision of accessible, inclusive facilities and services across the organisation. She is an Indian-Irish disabled woman who holds a master's degree in disability studies from the University of Leeds and a professional diploma in human rights and equality from the Institute of Public Administration and the Irish Human Rights Equality Commission. Selina has been an activist and an academic in the international disabled persons movement for more than 25 years. She is regional ambassador for INUIG Centre for Disability Law and Policy, Justice Research Project. She's also a busy wife, mother, and passionate home chef. So delighted to have you here this morning, Selina. So it's all yours.
Thank you, Ger. It's great to be here this morning. We have my slides, so I just get working ahead. No? Sure, I'll get talking and we can catch up slides-wise. So thank you for the opportunity today to share my experience and observations regarding universal design, and in particular the new European standard. My observations are based on my experience as a disabled person, public servant, mother, academic, and activist. As you said, I've worked for South Dublin County Council since 2002. And I've also been active in the international disabled people's movement for well over 25 years. I have a deep understanding of how essential it is to approach equality and human rights and indeed accessibility in an intersectional way. With this presentation, I'm going to explore the importance of universal design and accessibility in the built environment. Sorry, I'm just getting the slides working there. As foundation of sustainable, vibrant communities. And I'm going to use personal and professional experience as a disabled person and an access officer and real life examples rather than quoting statistics, regulations and legislation. I'm also going to share a selection of photographs to illustrate aspects of my presentation. And I'll also be able to provide these afterwards if anybody would like them with alt text to give a much more detailed explanation of them than what I'll give this morning. Can you, no. Oh, here we go. Accessibility to the built environment significantly impacts on a person's everyday life. Good access or design empowers, enables, and facilitates dignity. Inaccessible environments create disabling barriers, which have a significant impact on the lives and choices of people with mobility impairments, and indeed our wider networks of family and friends. The slide you'll see here today is a cartoon that the disabled person said, "Excuse me, barman, can you tell me the way to the disabled toilets?" And the barman saying, "Not only will I tell you the way, sir, but I'll call you a taxi to get there." I sincerely hope that as we emerge from 2 years of lockdowns and restrictions, wider society may have gained a greater understanding of the impact that social interaction and freedom of access has on our mental and physical health and well-being. As a wheelchair user who often has to plan professional and social activities around accessible toilets, it was quite interesting, to use one word, to hear people on the radio complaining about temporary restrictions to access and public toilets being closed. And I'll come back to the issue of accessible toilets later in my presentation. We are here today to launch the new European standard on accessibility and usability of the built environment. But I think it's worth acknowledging the historical, societal benefits of universal design. For example, voice-to-text software was originally created to facilitate the access needs of those who are unable to physically type or those who have literacy difficulties. However, these days, voice-to-text is a widely used communication method in business and general society. Automated doors make access easier for most people, and lower counters facilitate children and people who are of shorter stature. An example of the wide benefit of accessibility from my recent work would be the Button by Neatbox. This touchless pedestrian crossing control system is being piloted in 2 locations within South Dublin County. With Button, you can use your mobile phone to virtually press the pedestrian crossing button. This is of great benefit to people with mobility or manual dexterity difficulties. It is interesting, however, that this system was developed as an access solution pre-pandemic, but in a more touchless world has the potential to be benefit of wider society. A council's core function is to provide essential services and infrastructure to the diverse communities we serve and to support and build sustainable communities where all the people of the county feel valued, welcome and included. In order to fulfill this function, we must take universal design, diversity, intergenerational families and intersectionality into account. If we look back into history, we see that traditionally families were intergenerational. However, then as social norms changed and the economy grew, families became smaller and more insular. In recent decades, largely influenced by economic considerations, families have once again become intergenerational as adult children remain in the family home and working parents rely on older family members for childminding and other caring duties. Intersectionality is a framework of understanding how social identities such as gender, race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, ability, and gender identity overlap with one another. Understanding intersectionality with regard to disability is essential for the creation of appropriate laws and policies and design and delivery of accessible, inclusive facilities and services. What makes disability unique is that anyone, regardless of age, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, or social economic status, can become a disabled person at any stage in their life. I believe the importance of intersectionality is recognized in the UN Sustainable Development Goals and targets, where they state that the goals are integrated and indivisible, global in nature, and universally applicable. By focusing on universal design principles, we can move away from the often held presumptions that access only benefits disabled people, and that access is mainly focused on provision of toilets, ramps, and parking. And I just included a photo here of a t-shirt I happen to love that says, "I'm only in it for the parking," and it has the wheelchair symbol on it, because I spend a lot of time talking about toilets. By focusing on universal design, the access needs of deaf or blind people, children, older people, and those with learning or literacy difficulties are also acknowledged. It was interesting that when we were developing the South Dublin play space, which I'll mention a little bit later, by far our greatest number of conversations around disability or accessibility were actually in relation to children with autism. This new European standard is the first of its kind for universal design. And I welcome the fact that it is a standard rather than a set of guidelines, and that the emphasis on moving from minimum to good practice, as often the minimum does not facilitate universal access. For example, wheelchairs come in a variety of shapes and sizes, but in my experience, the minimum only facilitates a basic manual wheelchair. I am also pleased that the standard emphasizes good rather than best practice, because no matter what we do, we can always do better. The COVID-19 pandemic has had an immeasurable impact on communities and access to services. A lot of hard fought for access was eroded during the pandemic. Disabled people have felt this impact quite profoundly in many ways, from our personal assistants not being allowed to accompany us to essential medical appointments, to the removal of accessible parking spaces to facilitate outdoor dining and social distancing. I am proud, however, to tell you that in South Dublin County, we did not sacrifice any of our public accessible council provided parking spaces, as I believe this is a clear example of the council's commitment to accessibility. This new standard will provide opportunities for shaping the post-COVID world. Our experience of the pandemic and emergence from it have reinforced the importance of designing inclusive environments, workplaces, and communities that satisfy the needs of any person without compromising those of another. My role as the Council's Disability Liaison Access Officer involves assisting the Council to meet its responsibilities under disability, equality, and human rights legislation, and to support the provision of accessible, inclusive facilities and services. One aspect of my role is carrying out traditional access officer duties, such as proofing plans and drawings, access snagging, and participating in multidisciplinary teams when various plans are being developed. So I've developed a strong rapport with many of our planners and architects. I find this part of my work fascinating, and I've learned a lot over the years, such as how to read plans, how to speak the language of planners, architects, and various trades. As a disabled person, I get great personal satisfaction from being able to effect positive change and contribute to our vibrant and diverse communities. The legislative environment for accessibility in Ireland over the past 25 years has slowly evolved toward one that understands and values universal design. And I've just given a slight snapshot here of the emergence of various pieces of access and equality related legislation since 1996. We have come a long way since the Strategy for Equality in 1996 and its 402 recommendations of actions required to provide access, equality, human rights, and inclusion for disabled people in Ireland. One of those 402 recommendations referred to the need for law and regulations to bring about the universal rights of access. Gradually, we've moved towards a society where disabled people will have the right to expect universal access. 25 years after a statute for equality, we finally have European Standard 17210, and I look forward to using the standard within my work. According to Census 2016, the total number of disabled persons in Ireland reached 13.5% of the population. It was also recorded that there were 468,000 households with at least one disabled person. However, when you take intersectionality and intergenerational communities into account, universal design clearly has a much wider reach than 25% of the population. What I have here now is just a couple of slides showing various access-related works and initiatives across South Dublin County. We have Lucan Weir and Valhalla Sustainable Accessible Housing in this first slide. South Dublin County Council provides and funds a broad range of services, including housing, roads and public lighting, walking and cycling routes, parks and playgrounds, libraries, litter control, art centres, and community infrastructure. It also serves as a platform for local democracy, with 40 councillors distributed across 6 electoral areas. Local authorities have to comply with a variety of laws and regulations connected with various core services that we deliver. And on this side, you'll see a mobile library and our purpose-built frame football pitch being enjoyed by some of our frame football team in Lucan. These laws and regulations are applied at local level through documents such as county development plans, local area plans, housing strategies, and so on. And this slide shows you the stepped and ramped entrance to County Hall and one of our pedestrian facilities in multi-use facilities in Tala. Section 4.5 of the European standard states that accessibility should be integrated at all stages of procurement, design, construction, and conformity assessment. This way of working is not a new concept within the South Dublin County Council. A core value of our corporate plan is inclusiveness, equality, and accessibility. And an overarching consideration with our current development plan includes a reference to creating socially and physically inclusive neighbourhoods. And I'd like to take a little moment to tell you about our inclusive play spaces programme to demonstrate this. The slide on screen now is an aerial shot of one of our accessible play spaces in Graffine in Lucan. We build playgrounds and play spaces with the assumption they're places for everyone to play together. We see inclusiveness as centrally important to all of our play spaces and aim to create places that meet the diverse needs of children, their parents, their grandparents, and other caregivers. Universal design criteria were included in the tender documents during the procurement process for the play spaces. And this is a selection of some of the accessible features within our play spaces. We've got a basket swing and a wheelchair accessible sand pit, and children enjoying them. We avoided plastics and used natural materials where possible. In addition to environmental and sustainable benefits, using natural materials has provided significant sensory benefits. And we've now started to focus on the design and installation of communication boards to further enhance the accessibility of the spaces. The image here on screen is a mud play area, pigsty, with large wooden carved pigs. And this was actually designed in collaboration with students and teachers in St. Joseph's near Timon, which is a school for children with additional educational support needs. As a disabled person and a disability access officer, I spend a lot of time discussing toilets with colleagues, inspecting plans, measuring and photographing toilets. And my family, particularly my daughter, find this so amusing that I've even been gifted with a mini toilet pencil holder for my desk. Lack of access to appropriate sanitary facilities has a significant impact on dignity, families, and family life. For example, the absence of changing places, accessible toilet facilities, has resulted in families not being able to go out together if a family member has significant access needs, or in many cases, disabled people being laid on the floor of a public toilet to have their sanitary needs met. Changing place facilities are finally starting to emerge across the country. And for example, in South Dublin in 2021, we installed 2, and we've got 2 more underway. Changing places facilities are not required under current regulations, but I'm aware that EN 17210 was used as a reference by the working group developing the new regulations and TGDM, so I'm hopeful for the future. When my daughter was a baby, I could not find any accessible baby changing facilities. Even though most were located within the accessible toilet, I was also limited to about 4 places that I could go shopping with her, because most accessible toilets are not big enough to accommodate a wheelchair user, an assistant, and a child in a pram all together. And there were no accessible toilets within the parent and child facilities. Changing place toilets will help alleviate this problem for disabled parents and caregivers in the future. And when I'm advising on access works within the council, I always specify the height the baby changing shelf should be installed at to provide universal access for parents and caregivers. And this slide just shows the signage and a mix of a family crossing the road with a wheelchair user pushing a pram, something I did many times in the past when my daughter was a baby. And just finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about consultation. And I particularly value the contribution made by South Dublin County Disability Advisory and Consultative Panel, which is largely comprised of disabled people who live, work, or study in the county. I also very appreciative to what I call my youth access officer. He's a young disabled man from the county who really helped us to make sure that the inclusive play spaces were properly inclusive. And you can see him in this image here in the wheelchair, James, and he was testing an accessible trampoline for us and helping us to make it more accessible. Disabled persons are an untapped potential resource. We go through our days frequently risk assessing, problem solving, and lateral thinking. Recognizing the value of lived experience is essential. And so I was very pleased to see accessibility consultation included in the standard. Listening to people with lived experience is essential to creating sustainable, accessible facilities and services. It's also essential for achieving value for money, because listening to lived experience enables the targeting of expenditure in appropriate ways. In South Dublin, local structures such as the Public Participation Network and our Disability Advisory Panel and the Housing Disability Steering Group and our online consultation portal provide essential opportunities to consult with the experts by experience. When the inclusive play spaces were being developed, everyone recognized the benefits of play for children with autism, but a major fear from parents was around how their children's behavior was perceived by others. They pointed to so many rules of the playground which their children may break and the reaction of other children and parents. These conversations with parents had a big impact on our design considerations and layouts. This experience emphasized the value of learning from lived experience. In conclusion, I would like to congratulate the teams in the Centre for Excellence in Universal Design and the National Standards Authority of Ireland on the launch of the first European standard on accessibility and usability of the built environment, incorporating universal design principles. Disabled people are intersectional beings who need and have a right to expect accessible facilities and services that are delivered with dignity and that are sensitive to the diversity of our needs, experiences, and backgrounds. Universal design is truly is the foundation of sustainable, vibrant communities. And I believe that implementation of this standard will make a significant positive contribution to the quality of life of all members of the community. Thank you.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Selina. I suppose bringing both your lived experience, but also your professional background and your day-to-day work with Dublin South County Council inspiring presentation, as I see they're coming in on the Q&A feed. So thank you very much for that, Selina. So next we have an introduction and I suppose the context of the standards and the functional and technical requirements publications that are part and parcel of what we're talking about here this morning. So we have Ruth O'Reilly and Tom Gray to speak next. So Ruth is a fellow colleague who's worked with me for over 10 years at the present moment in time, and in the last 2 years, she's now taken on the role as Senior Built Environment Design Advisor at the Centre for Universal Design as part of the National Disability Authority. And her work very much looking at promoting universal design of the built environment being her central area, but also linking in with her colleagues in the whole area of services and products, and also information communication technologies. Ruth is an architect with a keen interest in design and how it can have a positive impact on well-being, diversity and inclusion. So delighted to have Ruth, but also we have Tom Gray, who is actually the chair of this subcommittee, who has a degree in architecture from Dublin Institute of Technology and a master's in architecture from the University of Auckland in New Zealand. Following 10 years in practice, working on projects in Ireland, UK, Europe, the US and in New Zealand, Tom joined Trinity House Research Centre in Trinity College, Dublin as a research fellow in 2009. Since then, he has undertaken a variety of urban design and building design research projects, examining how people-friendly design can support human performance, health, well-being, and social participation. Much of this work focuses on age-friendly and dementia-inclusive communities, hospitals, long-term care settings, housing, and gardens. The work is underpinned by universal design and participatory design and co-creation processes. So, Tom, to lead out on this, delighted to have you here this morning, and well done on chairing this subcommittee for the last 4 or 5 years, I think.
Thanks, Ger. Much appreciated. And welcome to everybody on the call. I'm just going to move on my slide. Okay, so there are 3 standards that we are introducing today, and these are the adopted Irish versions of the 2021 European standards covering accessibility and usability of the built environment. So the 3 standards are as follows. There's the main document, which is ISEN 17210. You've heard some of our previous speakers talking about it. And this introduces common minimum functional requirements and recommendations to achieve an accessible and usable built environment, which is underpinned by universal design and a design for all approach. Then the second document we'll be talking about is a supporting document. And this provides technical performance criteria and specification to fulfill the requirements set out in the previous mentioned 17210. And then finally, the third document covers conformity assessment. And this is about providing criteria to assess the conformity of works or a project in line with the main document 17210. And we'll explain these a little bit further as we go along. Now, just to say, I suppose that it's important that to say that these standards were developed under mandate M420. Now, mandate M420 was a 2007 standardization request by the European Commission and European Free Trade Association in support of the European accessibility requirements for procurement in the built environment. Now, procurement has been mentioned a couple of times by Geraldine earlier on, and certainly by Selina. And again, this is a really important part of these standards in terms of both public and private procurement. And procurement is seen as a key mechanism or leverage or tool in which to build and create a more accessible, universally designed environment. So we look at the why procurement is so important, and I've just grabbed a couple of examples here, and only looking just an example at public procurement across the EU. So if we look at this, we see that over 250,000 public authorities in the EU spend around 14% of GDP. That's $2 trillion, or 2 trillion euros, excuse me, on the purchase of services, works, and supplies. So a huge amount of money that we can be using towards developing a more inclusive environment. In many sectors such as energy, transport, waste management, and so on, public authorities are the principal buyers. And finally, the public sector can really use this procurement to boost jobs, growth, and investment. But most importantly, I suppose, from the point of view of standards like this, use it as a mechanism to procure, manage, operate, design an inclusive environment. So to go back for a moment to the three documents. The first document, which is the main document, and the scope of this document, as set out, is to describe basic minimum functional requirements and recommendations for an accessible, usable built environment following Design for All / Universal Design Principles, which will facilitate equitable and safe use for a wide range of users, including persons with disabilities. The requirements and recommendations in the document are applicable across the full spectrum of the built environment, from outdoor spaces and public spaces right through to more detailed elements. And you'll see that spoken about in a little while. The functional accessibility and usability requirements are also applicable to existing buildings as well as new builds. So they're useful for adaptability and retrofit. Now, I won't go through all of these, but just to say that the contents, again, as I said, go across the full spectrum of the built environment. But there's some really useful stuff, some really great material here. Section 5 looks at diversities of users and design considerations, a really fantastic piece of the document. And then we move from wayfinding, access in the outdoor environment, through to very specific and criteria for internal spaces such as sanitary accommodation and so on. But it also covers a range of additional building uses and functions that you often don't get in standards like this. So we see recommendations around cultural, leisure, administrative, outdoor leisure areas, transport facilities, and so on. So a very comprehensive document. Here's just a snapshot. I don't expect you to be able to read anything, but I just want to give you a sense of the information that's contained in 17210. It is full of really fantastic illustrations. It's one of the real strong points. And these are used in a very powerful way to communicate some of the key messages. Now, to move on to the second document, which is the technical performance requirements, technical performance criteria. So here's where there are specific and detailed criteria given to fulfill the requirements in 17210. And again, in that document, you now start to see specific values and an awful lot of detail. And then finally, the third document, as I said earlier on, this is about conformity and assessing whether built environment works conform with the standard 17210. And this is the third and a supporting document as part of the standard suite. And in this document, you'll find a number of templates and tools, such as the one I've illustrated there in front of you, which starts to give you essentially checklists and so on. So later on in the webinar, we'll have Eoin, Caitríona, and Fionnuala, and they'll talk in a little bit more detail about applying the standards and also looking at this in a little bit more detail. So they'll put a bit of flesh on the bone, so to speak. But in the meantime, I'm going to hand you over to Ruth, who's going to give you a little bit of background and context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom, for that introduction and background to the standards. So now I'm going to step back a level and I'm going to talk about the context in terms of policy and legislation. So that I suppose the context in which we'll be using the standard. And Selina spoke to us about the impact that the design of the built environment had on her everyday life. And at the Centre in Universal Design, we work to promote universal design as good design that works well for everyone. So that's across the built environment, which is our focus here today, but also across products and services and ICT. And we know in practice that the design of built environment, product and services, and ICT all need to come together for an overall design to be inclusive for everyone. So first of all, I want to talk about sustainability, and I just want to firmly position universal design at the center of sustainability. So the image on screen is a Venn diagram showing the 3 pillars: the social pillar, the economic, and the ecological pillar of sustainability, often referred to, of course, as people, profit, and planet. And while universal design clearly has a link and is closely aligned with the social pillar of sustainability, we also like to make the point that if you adopt universal design at the start of a project, it avoids retrofit at a later stage, which we know that retrofits can be very costly. And if we avoid retrofits, we're also avoiding waste, which is a key element of the circular economy. My next slide then is an image of the UN Sustainable Development Goals under the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And I just wanted to highlight to you 3 of the goals that are clearly aligned with universal design. So there's goal 3, which is health and well-being for all at all ages. Goal 10, which is to reduce inequality. And goal 11, which is to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. I also wanted to highlight that inclusion is a key element of the new European Bauhaus. So I have the logo of that on screen, and it contains 3 words: beautiful, sustainable, and together. Well, the new European Bauhaus is an initiative that's about connecting the European Green Deal to our daily lives and living spaces. And it sets out 3 values, which it says are inseparable values. And those values are sustainability, aesthetics, and inclusion. So again, inclusion as a key value of the new European Bauhaus at European level. Now, another important reference for us in using the standard is the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which reinforces the fact that universal design is not just a nice to have, because this is coming from a rights-based approach, and it's key to our work at the Centre for Excellence in Universal Design. And with regards to design of the built environment, I wanted to draw your attention to a number of sections in the UN CRPD. So first of all, something that Selina mentioned in our consultation, there's a general obligation in the UN Convention to closely consult with and actively involve persons with disabilities through disabled persons organisations in the development and implementation of legislation and policies, and in other decision-making processes concerning issues which relate to persons with disabilities. So that's clearly setting out the need to include people with disabilities and disabled persons organisations in the design process. And Selina gave us some good examples of that there in South Dublin County Council's work on playgrounds. I'd also draw your attention to Article 4 in the Convention. Under that, the state commits to undertake to promote research and the development of universally designed goods, services, equipment, and facilities. And then lastly, 2 other articles, Article 9 on accessibility and Article 19, living independently and being included in the community. And again, I think Selina's presentation clearly linked how a person's independence and participation in the community can be dependent on the design of their environment. So the decisions we make when we're procuring or when we're designing the built environment can have a huge impact on a person's everyday life. So I also want to briefly refer to the European Accessibility Act, which refers to the achievement of accessibility by the systematic removal and prevention of barriers, preferably through a universal design or a design for all approach. Now, the scope of the European Accessibility Act mainly applies to specified products and services, and it has been criticised for its weakness in relation to the built environment in particular, because the accessibility requirements for the built environment have been devolved to member states essentially with an optional clause. So unfortunately, it does allow for a possible scenario where an ATM is required to be made accessible, but it could be rendered useless to someone with a disability if the built environment in which it's located is not accessible. But it appears that the Act is going to have an impact on standards. There's a draft standardization request has been issued by the European Commission seeking to harmonise a number of standards for the purposes of the Act. And I have 3 of those standards on screen. One of them is the standard that we're talking about today, ISEN 17210. And that's the standard for the built environment. And also the standard 17161. So that's the design for all process standard for products, goods and services. And then the third one on screen is 301549, which is accessibility requirements for ICT products and services. So harmonizing a standard has the effect of making it mandatory rather than voluntary. So for example, the standard 17210 could become mandatory in relation to transport and banking services, which are within the scope of the European Accessibility Act, if Ireland decides to take up that optional clause that I mentioned. So I wanted then to move from a European level to a national level and talk a little bit about our own Disability Act 2005. And on screen, I have a slide that highlights the different areas of the Disability Act that have implications for the design of the built environment and the obligations for our public bodies in relation to that. So there's obligations for accessible public buildings under Section 25, for accessible services under 26, which I want to go into a little bit more detail on, for heritage sites in Section 29, and for employment and accessible workplaces in Section 47. And I know Fionnuala and Caitríona are going to talk about the range of guidance that's in this standard we're talking about today, 17210. I suppose in particular guidance that goes beyond what's in our technical guidance document M. And I think that it has the potential to be very useful to public bodies in relation to their obligations under the Disability Act in this regard. So it's not just for buildings, but also for services. So Section 26 says that when a service is provided by a public body, where it's practical and appropriate, it should ensure that the provision of access to that service by persons with and without disabilities is integrated. So in practical terms, that means that people with disabilities can avail of a service provided by a public body at the same access point or location and at the same time as everyone else, where that's practical and appropriate. And we get a lot of queries from people asking us, is there any legislative requirement in relation to items like playgrounds or footpaths or bus stops or parks to be accessible? So I just wanted to highlight to you the definition of a service in the Disability Act, because it's very broad and I think it's very, I suppose, relevant to the new standard we're talking about here today. So I try not to have too much text on my slides generally, but I just thought in this case, seeing the definition of a service in its entirety is useful. So a service means a service or facility of any kind provided by a public body, which is available to or accessible by the public generally or a section of the public. And it includes, and there's 4 clauses for what's included under a definition of a service. And in relation to the built environment, I think the first one is very important. It says the use of any place or amenity owned, managed or controlled by a public body. The second clause is the provision of information or an information resource or a scheme or an allowance or other benefit administered by a public body. The third is any cultural or heritage services. And the fourth is any service provided by a court or any other tribunal. But I think the first clause there, the use of any place or amenity owned, managed or controlled by a public body, obviously has a very large scope in relation to the built environment. And I think that ISEN 17210 can be a very useful resource to public bodies because it includes guidance on many areas that are not covered in our building regulations. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, which was a high-level look at the context in relation to policy and legislation for using the standard. So I hope it's useful to set the scene to you before our next speakers will bring you into more further detail. Thank you very much.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Ruth and Tom, for that and setting the context, but also giving an outline of the, I suppose, the significant amount of detail that are in the 3 documents that were published and we're launching here today. So moving on to, I suppose, looking at the regulatory connection. We're delighted to have Eoin O'Dowd here with us this morning and Caitríona Shaffrey. So Caitríona is a Royal Institute of the Architects of Ireland registered architect, also a fellow and past president of the Institute of Designers, and an RAI Conservation Architect Grade 3. Her practice, CPA Architects, is based in Dublin and covers interior architecture and architecture with particular interest in design for all, universal design in every aspect of the lived environment. She lectures extensively in interior design for over 17 years and continues to work in this sphere. She has worked as a consultant to other architects and has worked on numerous disability access reports. So delighted to have Caitríona, and also we have Eoin O'Dowd, who is Chartered Build Control Surveyor and Building Standards Advisor at the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage. He holds a diploma in law and is a Chartered Building Control Surveyor and a Registered Building Surveyor. He joined Carlow Fire and Rescue Service in 2008, working primarily in the area of fire prevention and building control. He was seconded to the Building Control Management Project in 2015 and joined Dublin Fire Brigade in 2016 as Senior Executive Fire Prevention Officer. Eoin joined the department in 2018, where he's been working primarily in the area of accessibility and fire safety. Eoin also lectures part-time in fire safety practice, postgraduate diploma in Trinity College Dublin in the area of building control legislation and technical guidance document B. So over to you, Eoin, and thank you very much for presenting here this morning.
Thank you very much, Ger. Good morning, everyone. For the next part of this webinar, I'll be looking at the system of building control in Ireland, the regulatory context for the design of buildings, including, and most importantly, from this point of view, the minimum standards of accessing and using buildings. I'll be looking at how a standard like EN 17210 may interface with that system. As I said, it is a system, a structure of regulation of the design of buildings, providing our minimum standards. At the head of it, the Building Control Act, providing the enabling legislation, giving rise to the building regulations and the building control regulations. Under the building regulations, we have a system of application. When do we have to apply our standards? We have the functional requirements. What do we have to do? What are our minimum performances? We have our technical guidance documents. How do we do it? We have a small number of exemptions for buildings, which I'll go into in a short amount of detail. Beside all of that, we have the building control regulations, a system of administration under which we have a system of notices or commencement notices or applications, fire safety certificates, and our disability access certificates, and our certificates of compliance and completion for certification of compliance on the conclusion of works. But ultimately, those building control regulations are there as a system of administration to ensure compliance with our building regulations, to provide those minimum performances of health and safety in our buildings. When we think about the building regulations, we're drawn most often to the technical guidance documents. The greatest comparator in terms of EN 17210 is our technical guidance document M, Access and Use, which is currently out for public consultation for update, which I'll again come back to later on. But before we go into the requirements, it's important to understand the structures of when and how to apply the regulations. Under Article 8, we have exemptions. There are a small number of buildings which are exempted from the requirements, like temporary buildings, ancillary accommodation to dwellings like sheds or glasshouses, mobile conveyances or lighthouses. When we do have to apply them, we must apply the works in accordance with the building regulations and can't make an existing building worse, no new or greater contravention. New buildings and extensions have to comply with the requirements. Certain material alterations have to comply with requirements where they have a structure, a fire safety, or an access and use requirement, but it's only the works. And certain material changes of use, moving the building from one use to another, have to comply with our requirements, including the requirements of Part M. What it leads to is a progressive improvement in our requirements of access and use and of health and safety in and around our buildings. What are our minimum performances? They're set out in a high level functional requirements that adequate provision is made for people to access and use a building, to approach and access an extension, that sanitary facilities are to be, where they're provided, they should be provided for people for access and use within an extension. Supporting those requirements, those high level functional statements, are the technical guidance documents that where they're followed, they prima facie indicate compliance with the building regulations, but they are still our minimum standards to be met. In the context of EN 17210, we may publish technical guidance documents. Those technical guidance documents are prima facie compliance, but they don't prohibit the use of any other suitable standard or specification for compliance with the building regulations. And that's where a standard like EN 17210 may come in. This is highlighted in our TGDs, that the relevant requirements must be complied with. So the TGDs set out our requirements, minimum performances that can be perhaps built upon using a standard like 17210. But in using them, a building control authority may require evidence to establish that the minimum performances are being met. So it falls to the designer to make sure that our minimum requirements are being met in a proper way. In looking at EN 17210, as I said, we have a suite of technical guidance documents, 12 documents delivering the compliance with the requirements of the building regulations. Part M is most relatable to EN 17210. When you do a deep dive into 17210, it also has requirements in respect of fire safety, in respect of ventilation, and preventing falls across a void or an edge, falls out windows or fall through a window. It has requirements in respect of energy control in buildings, all of which are covered by a great number of building regulations and technical guidance documents. So it's important to understand the context in which the standard is being applied and the requirements which it may be attempting to comply with. In applying a standard like EN 17210, it is a comprehensive document. There's an awful lot of detail in it, many components of which are complementary to technical guidance document M. But care does need to be taken in the use and application of any alternative whole document approach. I have a few examples of differences and variations between TGDM and 17210. In TGDM, our minimum performances for the rise of a flight in buildings, generally, we would have a requirement for a landing every 1.8 meters. This would provide an adequate place of rest for someone ascending the stairs. When we look at EN 17210, it has a functional requirement that regular landings are provided at regular intervals to provide a user with rest. And under the supporting standard TR 17621, it specifies 16 rises between flights, or spaces limited, no more than 20 rises, which could give to a construction solution that has landings at every 2.4 meters, which is different from that of TGDM. And so in designing buildings, care does need to be taken to make sure that the minimum standards are being met. Similarly, At the moment, Technical Guidance Document M is out for draft for public consultation to enhance its provisions to include for changing places facilities in the built environment to facilitate the greater use of the built environment by individuals, irrespective of ability. Under 17210, the requirements for changing places facilities are specified for large transport facilities, roadside petrol service facilities, retail and leisure complexes, without going into detail of what constitutes a large transport facility or a large service facility. When we look at the proposed list of requirements in TGDM, there's a far broader scope of application of the CP facilities: hospitals, care centres, assembly buildings, schools, offices, shops, shopping centres, hotels, etc., with minimum floor areas or area capacities that apply and are specified in detail in the TGD. So again, EN 1720, it can be used as an alternative approach. The provision is made in legislation. However, care needs to be taken in the use and application, the direct application of the provisions, to make sure that the minimum performances in the TGD are still being met and that the policies set out through the TGDs are being obtained. If we move on for a moment from the technical or guidance documents and the building regulations, we also have a system of administration of our building control in Ireland. A number of building uses and types require a disability access certificate to be lodged and granted by the local authorities before the building can be used. When the application is made, the requirements and particulars of the application have to relate to Part M, our access and use requirements. Where a local authority is making a decision on that application, it is limited in its extent in terms of making a decision in respect of Part M. So again, in the use of 17210, which is a fantastic document when you look at all of the depth and detail for the use of the built environment, both inside and outside buildings, it does go further than what we would envisage in the technical guidance document. Matters of fire safety or of prevention of falls, matters of management in buildings, which is again important when we move from the design and build phase through to the operation and use phase. But it's only the matters of the building regulations which should be captured in as part of a disability access certificate. So we do have our system of building control and our building regulations. We have our Part M requirements, our minimum performances supported by TGDM. We allow the use of alternative approaches. They are enshrined in the legislation, but care does need to be taken. 17210 is a useful document with a lot of detail in it. But the minimum performances that we would set out do still need to be met. And diligence needs to be taken in applying the criteria prescriptively. Is it worse than TGDM? Has enough proof been provided that the minimum performances that are required have been met? Thank you very much for your time. I'll pass you over to my colleague, Caitríona.
Very much, Eoin. Okay, well, I'd just like to talk a little bit about the beyond Part M aspect of it. And one of the key areas that was mentioned earlier in the introduction by Tom was the aspect of diversity. So many of the areas like wayfinding and that have a very big implication for diversity when you look at seeing, hearing, touch, taste, allergies and hypersensitivity, immunology, physical abilities, and cognitive abilities. And these all come into play very much in the areas, the main areas I'm going to speak about, which are wayfinding, and particularly navigation in the urban environment, where visual contrast, tactile info, audible info, signage and pictograms all come into play and sometimes conflict with and cause confusion. Access in the outdoor environment, where you've got accessible routes, junctions, street furniture, graphics and planting, and shared spaces, which is both a positive and a difficult thing to do very well. And then you have outdoor and urban areas, which again, during the pandemic, this area became so much more important to all of us. Playgrounds, parks and nature parks, and access to green spaces. Now in the next slide, you'll see in terms of, could I have the next slide, please? Wayfinding in the urban environment. One of the issues that I think this new document covers very well is the problem we have with modern buildings, particularly in large estates, where you have buildings that are very similar, they're done possibly to let, and therefore they are flexible. But because they're flexible, they lack an awful lot of character and indicative marks. So you find, say, for example, here on the right-hand side, you've got a building halfway down a street, or nearly halfway, and it's called Number 1 Park Place. And it's indicated by this red slash outside. You couldn't really find it very easily without that. So this is where graphics has to be applied to a building. And the diagram that's shown in the document shows very clearly clues that you can give as to where an entrance might be and how you would highlight it. Could I have the next slide, please? So again, on the top left there, you can see a building where the only clue you have as to where the entrance might be is because there's a projecting bay that goes all the way down to the ground. So we're looking all the time for these visual clues. The bottom left group of slides is talking about images which are in everyday use, such as bus stops. And again, speaking with somebody who has a 90% blind definition, she has advised me that the new graphics for Dublin Bus, where there's the green on the yellow, are not giving enough contrast for her to see very clearly. The original image for Dublin Bus, which is clear, you know that that's a symbol for Dublin. It's very easily recognizable. There's very good color contrast. Also, when you have signage, that you have good contrast, you know, black on white or white on black or light color against a dark color is very clear. You can also use this to highlight things like doorways or steps so that you know when or where the hazard is going to be. Could I have the next slide, please? One of the things that I think is very interesting about this is when you go to a country where the language is totally different. This is an image from Nagoya, where I didn't understand the language when I was there. So I was looking for visual clues the whole time to see where I was in relation to where I was going or where I was staying. On the left-hand side there, it just gives you a couple of things about accessible routes, things like visual controls, lighting on accessible routes, and tactile objects to help you find your way. Next slide, please. So again, one of the really difficult things that I've come across is where things like pattern and people not fully understanding it. You can see an image on the bottom of somebody wearing clothes the same color as the background, and you can see how hard it is to discern the object. So, and then on the top right, you've got manifestations on the window, which appear almost like little holes in the surface. This can be difficult for people with dementia, that they think that there's little openings in the surface. Likewise, one of our Dublin bridges, casting very, very big shadows, which could read like an obstacle on the surface below. That's just sunlight. And then the bottom left illustration is when there's a plethora of signs, it's really difficult to focus in and read them very clearly. Again, could I have the next slide, please? So this again is looking at, this is a very good diagram, I think, from the document 17210, where it shows you very clearly, you know, the type of information, the scale of information. On the right-hand side, the first slide illustrates where you have so many signs you don't see any. It's really difficult to focus in on them. Whereas at the bottom, this is a photo from the new National Rehabilitation Hospital, where they did a lot of research, and Daisy Ward, for example, just became Daisy. It's very clear, very quick and easy to recognize. And on the top right, then there's a changing places sign, which incorporates Braille and raised lettering. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so in the outdoor environment, one of the things that has really, really improved, and this document will help to pull it along further, I believe. The top left photograph there is a lovely example of sheltered housing out in Dunleary-Rathdown. Very connectable, very easy to follow. The planting indicates the wayfinding. The top right is a recently completed car park at the Cashel Palace. Very level surfaces, very good drainage that sort of is very shallow and not a trip hazard. And then on the bottom left, where we have these bogland walkways, which have made our natural environment so much more accessible to buggies and wheelchairs and the general public. And then you have areas like the top right, where there's a serious conflict of signage. It's just so much going on. It's really quite difficult to know exactly when and where you should cross. Clear signage then, this is actually inside in a building, but it's just very clear, very simple, very obvious. You're going to level 5. And then within the document, it also shows, for example, the toilet symbol. On the bottom left there, symbol 3, there's a little indicator that tells you where the Braille will be, the raised lettering. So it's again very clear what's going on where. Could I have the next slide, please? Again, street furniture and planting. The top right slide is a situation I want to describe to you. I was with somebody who was visually impaired, and there was a large truck parked on top of the pavement illegally. And the space between those signboards and the truck was about 600 mil, roughly. And I had to grab her arm to stop her walking into the projecting sign, which was projecting about 150 mil. You're allowed 100 mil. So it just shows you, normally she wouldn't have walked that close, but because the truck was there, she was walking closer to the boundary wall. Again, level surfaces. Again, this is an area that's improved hugely. We have a lot of our parks, etc., very accessible. On the bottom slides there, the top one is Clonakilty, which is a wonderful example of a street where older people can sit and rest, and it makes for a very convivial environment. And just 2 other illustrations just showing breakups of areas which make it much more accessible. Again, these diagrams in the middle here, they're all from the document, and I think they're very clear. And it actually shows some of the instances I'm talking about where you can have problems that are to some degree unforeseen, particularly with things like branches of trees that need to be maintained, etc. Could I have the next slide, please? Again, when we're designing our city streets, having places to stop and sit, to break up spaces so that it's not just all about the traffic flow. You know, there are places like this where you have seating, again, possibly for older people, giving them space to sit and relax or just to catch their breath as they move along their day. Next slide, please. One of the areas that's improved hugely, I put in this slide, the bottom left slide is from a lady called Niamh Kent, who's an occupational therapist who works with children in the natural environment. Children with trouble, she gets them to hang upside down out of trees. So again, our green, diverse spaces are becoming more and more useful. The middle illustration is a potential play link area for children, for people of all abilities. And on the right-hand side, you have another park. I wish I had seen the earlier park that Selina had. It looked like a really interesting space. Next slide, please. Again, walkways and nature, just talking about parks and nature. This is again where the document really starts pulling things on for us, making us look at things, how we can improve, how we can develop. This is Castlecomer Discovery Park. I was down there recently and there were people in wheelchairs. It was all very level. It was all very easy, which is, I think, how it should be. And the other one, the other diagram on the right-hand side is talking about accessible beaches, which is a really interesting area and a really good area that should be looked at very closely. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, ISEN 17210 brings more detail to the external environment, but there are further developments that are likely to happen. And the next section is problems that arise in practice will now be illustrated in the next presentation by Fionnuala Rogerson. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Caitríona and Eoin. I suppose setting the national context, and it's not straightforward how standards be integrated not only at a national level, at a regulatory level, but also as Caitríona highlighted, the practical issues on the ground that we still have to resolve and work through. So we have next Fionnuala Rogerson, who is a Fellow of the Royal Institute of Architects in Ireland, practicing architect and author of several publications on universal and inclusive design. For over 20 years, she was director of the International Union of Architects work program Architects for All, working with architects globally to promote inclusive universal design as a fundamental component of architectural quality and sustainable built environments. She was a member of the SEN research team, which completed the first stage of the EU mandate, leading to the development of EN 17210. She is currently working with several NSAI and ISO standards committees on accessibility and usability of the built environment, including heritage sites. So delighted to have Fionnuala here presenting.
Thank you, Ger. Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be here with you today. I'm going to be talking about using these standards in practice, and first of all, why we should use them. The suite of standards, EN 17210, and the technical reports that accompany them are, in fact, the first European-based standard on accessibility and usability to the built environment. And they have been developed based on consensus, not only of all the 15 standards organizations that participated in developing them, but also approximately 10 user organizations, including the European Disability Forum, ANEC, the European Voice on Standardization, the European Union, and many others. So it's a completely up-to-date suite of standards published only some months ago. They cover a wide range of users, locations, building types, and details. There's a clear distinction made between the requirements and the recommendations, which I'll explain further on. And they're extensively illustrated, which is quite unusual for standards. And particularly for us as architects, it's great to have a standard that is illustrated, not only with good examples, but also it does show some examples of what not to do. And in the TR, it gives examples of the technical requirements in graphic form. The diversity of users and design considerations that are not covered by the technical guidance document Part M include things such as the immunological functions, allergies and hypersensitivities, physical abilities, whilst Part M includes or is based on independent use of the built environment. The EN 17210 also includes situations where people may require assistance, voice and speech functions, and also cognitive abilities and characteristics such as perception, memory, decision-making, dyslexia, dementia, and autism, amongst others. Basic functional requirements which aren't covered in the technical guidance document include wayfinding, which Caitríona has spoken a little about, Outdoors, she also mentioned routes, plazas, shared space, guidance paths, bridges, underpasses, and the like. It covers a lot of external areas such as arrival and departure areas. It covers the kind of variety of vehicles that you would normally meet, not just cars, but also coaches, taxis, minibuses with side access, rear access, electric vehicle charging, cycles and non-cycles, non-standard cycles, I mean, which are something that more and more people are beginning to use to mobilize in urban areas, and of course, parking for non-standard cycles as well. The kinds of things that aren't covered under M in relation to horizontal and vertical circulation include travelators and escalators. There's guidance on balconies, and this is something that we've had recent problems with, which have had to be referred to on board Fionnuala to make a decision on in relation to the TGD. Services and equipment, facilities for assistance dogs are covered, lockers, storage, public information screens, and evacuation is also covered, not in great detail, but there is quite a detailed informative annex to the standard. But you will understand the design objectives, you will understand issues such as places of safety and rescue assistance, and also covered are environmental conditions such as acoustics and indoor air quality. Specific uses covered in 17.2.10 that aren't covered by the technical guidance document include student accommodation, adaptable housing, libraries, museums, heritage buildings, gyms, swimming pools, and many others. Types of administration, service and employment buildings such as banks and courts, police stations, offices, industrial, educational, healthcare facilities, as well as religious facilities. And then outdoor and urban areas, including playgrounds, gardens, parks, and beaches. And finally, transport facilities, train stations, bus stations, coaches, metros, airports, ports, even cable cars are covered. So when you're using the document, I believe you need the two principal documents, 17.2.10, which is the functional standard, the functional requirements, and 17.6.2.1, which is the technical report, which gives the technical detail, which assists in demonstrating that you have actually complied with the functional requirement. So within 17.2.10, you have a clear distinction between the things that are requirements in order to comply with the functional standard, and they are illustrated with reference to the word shall. So for example, this example given here, functional uses for issues for a museum display, will be described such as exhibits shall be placed at a height accommodating everyone, captions shall be positioned at suitable height, and then when it's making a recommendation, it will describe it as a should. Accessible interactive devices should be available. Some exhibits should include tactile items or copies. And then when you turn to the technical report 17621, you will have the same illustration with the same details, the same topics, but in this case, it will give the technical requirements. So for example, standing height user, or at least the height of exhibits should be in a range between 1200 and 1600 for reading. The heights of controls should be at a specific height. Lighting, you're then cross-referenced back to the technical details for the levels of lighting, for acoustics, visual contrast, and so on. So you need always to cross-reference from the functional standard 17.2.10 to the technical report 17.6.2.1. Here I've just taken an example of the information provided on changing place facilities. On the left-hand side, you'll see an illustration of what in fact is required as a function of a changing place facility illustrated, and on the right-hand side, the technical details that allow you to check whether you have actually met the functional requirement. And I would just mention here that the draft consultation document out for the revisioned Part M of the building regulations to include data on changing place facilities is out for consultation at the moment, And I believe it has been based very much on what's in this European standard. There may be some differences, and I would encourage you all to refer to the consultation document and make submissions as you see fit. I believe they're open for submissions until early in May. The third document or technical report that comes with this standard is one on conformity assessment. And it describes very simply how to assess conformity based on the types of conformity, whether it's first party, second or third party, first party being self-certification, the types of functional requirements that you need to consider when you're determining which should be applied, the reference documents that you may use to ensure that you have conformed to national standards, could be building regulations, or it could indeed be this technical report 17621, the methodology to use, and then the stages at which you should assess conformity. And these would be inception, planning, construction, and completion. And then there are some sample tools and templates that can be used. We're pretty well used to doing this now here as designers, those of us who have acted as either a sign certifier or design certifier, and the procedures that we would normally use to assess conformity throughout the design process and through the construction and on completion would be somewhat similar. So we would be used to using this type of tool. So I would just like to then move on to giving a couple of examples of how we've been able to use the European norm in practice. And in both of these examples, I'm going to talk about areas in the external environment where it's not easy to find good guidance here in relation to external environments and accessibility and usability, because Part M doesn't really cover them. So this first case relates to the Cove Public Realm Enhancement Plan, currently being done by Cork County Council and Julia Vallone, who many of you will know, and which is about the revitalisation of the central area of Cove. As those of you who are familiar with Cove will know that it's very heavily trafficked with lots of car parking and movement in the centre of the town, and it has taken a lot from the sense of place that one might otherwise have had a couple of centuries ago in this historic and hillside town. Julia is trying to revitalise the town through this scheme, along with others in the County Council, and has had a lot of consultation with residents and visitors and organisations concerned. When she approached us, and we in turn approached the National Council for the Blind in Ireland to look at some of the detail of this area, to carry out an access audit first of all, and then to advise and discuss one of her proposals, which was to use shared spaces throughout the central part of the town. Now, for those of you who are familiar with shared space, you'll know that it's quite a contentious topic. Many people who are blind or vision impaired are not very happy with shared space, not just people who are blind and vision impaired, but also older people, people with children can be quite nervous in using shared space. So what's interesting about the EN 17210 is that there has been guidance given as to how shared space might be designed in such a way as to be acceptable to all users. So in working with Julia and with NCBI, we used the principles established in 17210, the principle of creating gateways at the arrival to an area that then uses shared space, creating comfort zones, meaning having spaces which would be pedestrian only, and even though it's on a level surface with the shared space or the carriageway area, they are nonetheless defined using the criteria given in the EN to ensure that they are identified as safe comfort zones. We followed the guidance on pavings and crossings and on the use of colour contrast to define spaces which were shared and spaces which were not, and the use of planting and street furniture as well in order to achieve the type of user-friendly environment that the design team were aiming for. And finally, I'm just going to mention a little bit about another project. This time it's in Temple Bar, working with Dublin City Council Roads Department on a new public realm improvement scheme for Temple Bar Square and the surrounding streets. Here we were able to follow the guidance on squares and using the guidance for accessible routes, guidance paths, crossings from one side to the other, color contrast, light reflectance values, and street furniture. And again, it was something that we have worked closely with users and other organizations as well in arriving at the final scheme. So I just, to finish, would like to give a word of caution nonetheless, because not everything in these standards go beyond TGDM. For example, the EN is based on a turning circle, if you like, of 1500 millimeters, whereas the technical guidance document to our building regulation M is based on an 1800, so it's a higher standard. Not everyone is covered by it as well. I've had reason recently to look to see if there was much information on bariatrics and type 3 obesity, and no, there isn't. There's actually not very much at all. So there is a lot of space too for improvement. And one other word of caution, and that is, of course, that builder regulations take precedence if you're faced with having to take a decision. But nonetheless, I would strongly recommend that all of you consider purchasing a suite of these standards, because there's a lot of information there which will be extremely useful to you in practice and will help in determining or in broadening your horizons in terms of the kind of information that's available for all the areas that Part M does not cover. So thank you very much indeed.
Great. Thank you very much, Fionnuala, for such insight, but also practical examples already of using this standard here in Ireland. So we're delighted that we have Minister Anne Rabbitte here with us this morning, Minister for State Responsibility for Disability, Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. So, Minister, thank you very much, and I know you've been listening to a number of the presentations here this morning, so I'd love to hear your views and your thoughts.
Good morning, and I'm very pleased to join your webinar today, and I hope you found it valuable and insights informative. And you're quite right, I have been sitting and listening and enjoying the presentation for some time there, so thank you very much. I think that it's important that everyone procuring and designing new buildings and retrofitting existing buildings is aware of the benefits of incorporating universal design and accessibility from an early stage in all of its projects. Universal design and accessibilities are a key part of design quality and should be recognised as beneficial to all users of all buildings or places. Earlier this month, I visited the House of Disabled People's Organisation in Copenhagen, described as the world's most accessible office building. Universal design was part of its design and construction from day one. It was largely used by disability groups, but that can be used also by organisations, groups and companies. It was a very impressive building, and one which showed how if universal design is incorporated from day one, it doesn't necessarily mean increased building cost. It exemplifies the UN CRPD to ultimate degree. I would highly recommend a visit to Copenhagen. I think that this new standard EN 17210 has the potential to become a very, very useful tool to enable universal design and accessibility to be integrated into projects as part of procurement and then throughout the design and construction process. I am conscious that accessibility of the built environment is central to Ireland's obligation under the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, in particular under Articles 9, accessibility, and 19, living independently and being included in the community. You will also have heard here today that the European Accessibility Act sets out that accessibility should be achieved by the systemic removal and prevention of barriers, preferably through a universal design approach, which contributes to ensuring access for persons with disabilities on equal basis with others. We still have work to do in Ireland to ensure access for persons with disabilities on equal basis with others becomes a reality, but standards like this one can support us as we work towards that goal. A practical example of how standards like the EN 17210 can influence positive change in relation to our minimum standard is the current consultation on amending Part M of the building regulations to provide changing places toilets in certain buildings. These are a facility that are badly needed to promote inclusion in our society, and I'm aware that the new standard was used as a key reference by the working group that developed the proposed changes to the regulations. I would encourage you to review the proposed changes of Part M to provide for changing place toilets and to respond to consultation process. While standards are a very useful tool, however, we must also recognise the importance of engaging with users as part of the design process. Taking universal design approach to user engagement means that we prioritise the involvement of users with a wide range of ages, abilities and preferences. This is also aligned with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which sets out the need for consultation and active involvement of people with disabilities in decision-making process that concerns them. Everyone involved in procuring, designing, building, maintaining, and managing the built environment needs to be aware that their decisions can impact on the everyday life of disabled people, from transport to education, employment, and housing. With user engagement in mind, I think another initiative for everyone here today to be aware of is the Town Centre First policy, which was launched by the government in early February. That policy notes that towns impact on our quality of life and should be attractive places for people of all ages, all abilities and all social backgrounds to live. It refers to another useful tool developed as a partnership between the National Transport Authority, Age Friendly Ireland, Green Schools and the CEUD, Universal Design Walkability Audit Tool for Roads and Streets. This is for audits intended to be carried out by a wide range of people of various ages and abilities. For example, parents with buggies, children's wheelchair users, older persons and people with low vision, to identify features of roads and streets that prevent them from focusing access, services and amenities with ease. I think that this standard, the EN 17210, has the potential to be a useful tool for local authorities when responding to walkability audits with improvements to our public realm, as its scopes includes external access routes like footpath, bus stops, public seating, and other out-street furniture. With this in mind, I want to remind you that Part M of the building regulation sets out minimum requirements for access and use in the built environment. Very often, we focus on regulation. The minimum requirements can be treated as the target rather than as a minimum. When we have that approach, the minimum requirements can often end up becoming the maximum standard achieved in practice. I believe that we need to rethink our mindset in relation to universal design. Good practice standards such as the EN 17210 can enable us to recognise and go beyond the minimum and have confidence that the specifications we seek are recognised at a European level. And can I thank all the presentators that I was listening to, because I really enjoyed the lady, I think her name was Caitríona, talk about actually when there's a car parked on that footpath and there's a bit of an overhanging tree. Simple things make an awful difference to persons' accessibility. So we need to look at the built environment, both indoor and out there. And thank you so much for having me this morning.
Great, thank you very much, Minister. And I suppose taking your time out of a very busy schedule and being there in the background listening to a number of the presentations, and definitely we've heard both officially and unofficially, your commitment to the whole area of disability and universal design. So we really appreciate your time here this morning. So thank you, Minister. Yeah, it just gives me great pleasure to close this webinar today. We're just about to move into lunchtime. So again, I suppose to what we will put on the screen here, where people can actually purchase the standards and through the National Standards Authority of Ireland. But I suppose what we've presented here today is showing, I suppose, a whole systems approach from European to national at a very much at macro level to meso, as it's often called, at an organisation level, where we had both Dublin South County Council, Cork County Council implementing the standard already at local, regional level. And I think Selina gave a powerful presentation on the whole lived experience, as well as Caitríona and Fionnuala examples there, what it is and how it can impact on the ground and the lived experience, not only for persons with disabilities, but for older people, for everybody using buggies, etc., moving luggage. So it is for everybody, which is, I suppose, the cornerstone of universal design. And to conclude, I suppose we've, over a number of decades, we've built great expertise here in Ireland, which has been recognised at European and international level on the work that we've done in standards and contributing to standards development. So a great shout out to the working committee that NSAI and ourselves have brought together, and their huge commitment. Again, as Geraldine Larkin mentioned at the very start, as in the public service that you have actually contributed on developing this standard, definitely has to be recognized here today. So wish you all the best in implementing the standard. And now you know where we live. As the saying goes, you can come and talk to us further on how best to implement this in practice. And this work will continue as we push on implementing the European Accessibility Act. So this work, sorry for the committee members, is only starting. Lots more work to do over the next couple of years. So with that, we're also looking anytime for new experts to join our committees. We have a number of committees: built environment, ICT, wheelchairs, assistive technology, aging society, working groups. So if people are interested on contributing and being part of this journey, we're always delighted to welcome new members. So with that, we will close this morning's webinar, and thank you very much for everybody who has attended. Hopefully you found that very useful, and we will be in contact with people who had other questions we didn't get a chance to. And as Elizabeth is putting up there, this webinar will be available shortly on the NSAI website.